So at the beginning of this chapter, we talked about the basic ideas of macroevolution, and really what I was trying to do is transition from chapter 13, which was microevolution, to the larger steps, if you will. And chapter 13, of course, comes first because it shows you that there are incremental little steps, and these incremental little steps can lead to something much bigger. And macroevolution is that bigger thing. Now, having heard a little bit about the kinds of things that can happen with macroevolution, now let's talk a little bit about the different models of macroevolution. And so when it comes to speciation and the way species diverge, obviously when you go back to the very end of chapter 13, you saw that there are two models that work. For example, we had this idea of diversifying or disruptive speciation. That was where you started with one peak and you ended up with two, right? That was one of the things we talked about. And then we had directional selection, where you had a peak and it shifted. And both of those kind of things work very well with a concept called gradual speciation. And gradual speciation simply means that over time you're accumulating a lot of small changes, and just as a drop of water when it hits a stone can eventually hollow out that stone, so a slow gradual process of many small accumulating changes can lead to new species and new forms and new functions and so on. And I think this is perhaps the intuitive model of speciation, where given that natural selection works in a certain way and given lots of time, that you can end up with a lot of changes and you end up with different species. And so gradual speciation is perhaps the type of speciation that is easily understood because it makes sense with all the different things we talked about. The problem with it is that when you consider a gradual model, you would expect that over the many millennia that evolution may occur, you would find some so-called transitional forms. Transitional forms are the kind of things you might want to see, where if you go from A to B, here's form A, and this is in the past, and perhaps form B is there today, you would like to see some of the increments. You'd like to see what the stages are between A and B. Because if you have the stages between A and B, then it means that you can follow evolution. You can kind of see what process went on. Remember, one of the things that was a problem for people like Mendel and Darwin is that they understood how things should work, but they didn't necessarily have the process. They didn't have the exact mechanism for how to accomplish the kinds of things that they were proposing. And so it is here. If we do have gradual speciation, you may say, well, there should be all these other little forms, these in-between forms between A and B. That would be something that would really satisfy us. But because these forms were missing, this had to lead to a different model for evolutionary speed. Now, one important thing to remember is that all of this needs to be put into the context of where we were with research. The scientific method hasn't been around formally for over 150 years. When we look at species, we need to go back to the 1950s. That was when Ernst Mayr produced his species concepts initially, and they were then being refined. And people were starting to understand by the 1950s more about genetics, but not that much yet. The revolution of molecular biology hadn't happened. That only came in the 1980s. And so there were limits. With these limits, people were looking at gradual speciation and they were saying, well, maybe it doesn't really work. So therefore, a different model was developed. This model was called Punctuated Equilibrium. It was produced in 1972. 1972 was when the paper came out that described this type of thing, punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium states that rather than having species diverge very slowly and gradually, instead what we're going to have is species diverge with little or no change for the remainder of the species' existence. And so when you look at the remainder of the species' existence, that could be a long period of time, and you basically don't have any change visible. Now, how does this work in practice? If you recall, I was trying to get you from A to B, and I was trying to explain why we don't see all these things in between. Why we don't see all these things in between in this model means that we have, because you had A, and then suddenly B, and then you just end up with a lot of B. So rather than having this long gradual transition and along the way at some point you make that switch from A to B, you're actually going from A to B very quickly, and then you end up with B for a long time. This would explain why there are no transitional fossils, and why perhaps B is simply the thing you would expect a lot of. So this obviously was something that would explain why you don't find the transitional fossils. Transitional fossils being the kinds of things that would give you the steps between A and B. This was something that rang true with a lot of people, and they said, aha, this is a competing model of speciation. It could be the other one, but if we don't find the transitional fossils, it must be something like this. Now, there is a key issue here, and the issue is where we find ourselves not even in evolutionary time, but where we find ourselves in real time. And one key issue of this in 1972 was President Nixon, and he went to China. And the reason why I say that this was an important thing is because a lot of these transitional forms were found in the Gobi Desert. Now, well, they weren't only found in the Gobi Desert, but that was one of the initial key areas, geographic locations, where these fossils were found. When I was a graduate student in the early 1990s, we had 2 Chinese PhD students who were brought over specifically on grants by the Canadian government, which is where I did my research, and they had transitional fossils with them. One of them was working on a very nice fossil that showed the transition between lizard and snake. The other one had a very nice fossil that showed the transition between a limbed amphibian and a limbless amphibian. Those are called caecilians. So both of them had similar things where the forms that they were transitioning to had lost the limbs, and so these were kind of like a salamander with really, really tiny limbs. And it was also a lizard with really, really tiny limbs. And these were transitional fossils that they had in China. Nobody knew about them. Since then, we've had all kinds of interesting areas with fossils discovered, also in the 1970s, because the other thing that happened is that in certain areas of the world there was a lot of decolonization going on. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because sometimes history makes itself felt throughout science and throughout human endeavor. Decolonization with stable governments. By the time the 1970s rolled around, several of the areas surrounding the Sahara Desert had decolonized, from France in particular and Britain, and they were making the area available for research. And in the Sahara Desert, just as in the Gobi Desert, there was a great treasure trove when it came to fossils. Well, where does this leave punctuated speciation? If we now have all these transitional forms, were they wrong? So let's take a look at what these 2 models are and how they may differ. One of these, the punctuated model, simply says that in order to get from A to B, one of the things you could do is have some kind of a fork, or maybe if it's not the fork, but instead you have A going to A and then one part splitting off and going to B, similar to this one, but key being here this event. That's the punctuation event right there. That would be pretty dramatic, and so you had this rapid change and then no change at all. Or, in contrast, the gradualist model, you don't really have a big event there, but it's just things are starting to change and become a little bit different. And this difference is obviously seen here in the colors of the butterfly, but somehow they end up on different evolutionary trajectories, one going that way, one going the other, and gradually, slowly, things are starting to move apart. So those are the contrasting models. Now note here the time scale. When I give you a time scale here, make sure that you think of it as generation time. There are no actual years here. So if you look at the punctuated model, it doesn't tell you how many generations pass in this area. It doesn't tell you how many generations pass in this area, right? It is an arbitrary scale. Similarly, when you look at the area down here, it doesn't tell you how many generations that is. Now look at this for a moment. You see that there is a split here, right? So what if we consider this split here the same split as that one there, and that this generation time here is exactly the same as this generation time here. Since there is no time scale, we don't really know how many generations this involves and how many generations that involves. Well, perhaps this here is 100 generations, and perhaps this here is 100 generations. We don't know. But when it comes to Earth time, long periods of time, for some organisms, 100 generations go by in an instant in terms of Earth time. Think of how long it actually takes for a drop to make a hole into a rock. It takes a long time. But it happens. But we don't know how long it's going to take. And so having a fundamental change, as in the punctuated model, may simply be an issue of having the right number of generations, which can be prepared by having a gradualist model with the same number of generations. So after all, these things really aren't contradicting each other. In fact, they can work together. And so I develop what I call consensus speciation. Consensus meaning that it is really not very useful to have these contrasting models and just let them sit there, because evolution is a very dynamic process. Evolution doesn't necessarily follow one way all the time or the other. And the key in this case is simply the definition of what a punctuation is. Well, perhaps a punctuation, which on your timeline may appear as a very small distance, if you expand that out, that distance, or zoom in, if you will, onto that time, it may still evolve hundreds of years. But think about that in terms of the evolution of certain organisms, and we're talking about millions of years. Well, 100 generations of butterfly evolution, that's just 100 years, really. So that's a very, very short period of time in a millions of years long timeline. So that would appear just like a punctuation. It would appear to be such a small amount of time, given the large scale timing of evolution, that it can appear like a punctuation. So several hundreds of generations really may appear to be just a punctuation. And ultimately, even a punctuated change may still be seen in the fossil record if you have these transitional forms in a relatively short period of time. So what I think is that most likely you see a combination of these things. In fact, in every type of organism, you may see some punctuations, because in every kind of organism's mutation exists. Mutation, remember, that was one of the ways by which microevolutionary change is established. You shift allele frequencies from one type to another by sometimes just having a mutation. And that's random. Well, that is a punctuation. That is clearly something that can have a fundamental effect on the population in an instant. Think of how we talked about polyploidy and sympatric speciation. Well, if a polyploid emerges, that's a punctuation. Now, in order to establish it in the population, that may take some time, but it's still an instant in time, literally, where some of these things can become manifested. But then you also have natural selection, and the idea behind natural selection is the population changes slowly over time, and it is moving from one type of population to another in diversifying selection over many generations. Or it is going through diversifying selection over many generations, where you separate the peaks out. So those clearly are more gradual in nature, but one will never exclude the other, because all of these are effects of microevolution ultimately. So consensus speciation is really the way I believe things occur.